Hi, y'all. This is your host, Carrie, and my show, Beyond the Accent. Thanks so much for joining me. So, accent, huh? The soul of language. It gives language its feeling and truth. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. See, pronunciation, what words sound like, is more than just a detail. It's at the very core of how we experience and understand language. And yet, for most language learners, pronunciation is treated as an afterthought, something you fix later. What if I told you that skipping pronunciation in the beginning actually makes everything a little bit harder for you? That when you mispronounce a word in your head, you're secretly learning two languages instead of one. Today we're talking about broken words, the hidden obstacles that trip up language learners, and why training your ears early on can be your biggest shortcut to fluency. Imagine this. You're an English speaker, and for years you've been convinced that the word scheme is pronounced sheem. You've read about color schemes, pyramid schemes, and maybe even the scheming con men who ran them. And then one day, you hear someone say, scheme, and your brain short circuits. Wait, that's the word that I've been reading this whole time? That's a broken word moment. It happens when the way you think a word is pronounced clashes with reality. Your brain has essentially split spoken and written language into two separate systems instead of treating them as one fluid thing. Now imagine this happening constantly to every new word you learn in a foreign language. That's the experience of many language learners, unfortunately. Here's a real-life example. A friend of mine who was in an advanced French class confidently brought up a philosopher she had read about, Descartes. She was, of course, talking about Descartes, the one we all know as Descartes, and she had read the name, but because she hadn't internalized the rule that most final consonants in French are silent, she didn't connect the word she had seen for the word that she had heard. And here's the problem. If you don't get pronunciation right from the start, you end up stockpiling broken words. Words that exist only in your head. And every time you try to use them in real life, you hesitate. You doubt yourself. You freeze. You avoid saying the word. In an ideal world, reading and speaking a language, they go hand in hand. You learn a word in writing, you hear it spoken, and everything just sort of clicks into place. But if you don't train your ears early on, that just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen on its own. Instead, you're stuck in a loop of second guessing. You read a word, but you're not quite sure how it's supposed to sound. So when you hear it spoken, you hesitate. Wait, is that the word I know? Or worse, you avoid saying the word entirely because you're unsure if you're pronouncing it right. This slows down everything. You don't speak as much because you don't trust your pronunciation. You don't hear new words as well because you're too focused on trying to decode them. You don't read as efficiently because every new word is a guessing game. Spoken language, it changes first, right? And writing just lags behind it. That's why, in a way, every language is actually two languages, the one that we read and the one that we hear. So if you want to learn efficiently, you need to make sure those two versions of the language aren't competing with each other inside your brain. Now, here's the fascinating part. Your brain is hardwired to ignore sounds it doesn't think are important. There's a famous study that tested Japanese speakers listening to the words rock and lock. For an English speaker, the difference is obvious, right? But for a Japanese adult who had never studied English, the two words sounded exactly the same. Literally, their brains didn't even register a difference. But after just 3 sessions of listening to rock and lock over and over with instant feedback, their brain rewired. Suddenly, they could hear the difference. This tells us something huge. You're not bad at pronunciation, your brain just hasn't been trained to hear certain sounds yet. So how does one fix this? There's 3 major elements. Number 1 is minimal pairs. That is, words that differ by just one sound, like rock versus log, sheep versus ship. When you train with them, your ears start picking up on subtle differences. They get used to them. Number 2 is listening before reading. This is interesting. Every time you learn a new word, listen to it first before you see it written. It does something for you. Number 3, mimic before memorizing. Just kind of focus on the sound and the melody, on the music of it all, separate from the meaning that the music is bringing with it. So it isn't just about pronunciation, right? It's about making learning easier for you at the end of the day. Now, let's talk about something that makes a lot of people nervous, having an accent. Here's the thing, a thick foreign accent doesn't just make you sound different, right? It actually changes the way people respond to you. So if your pronunciation is too far off, right, native speakers might assume you don't understand them well. And if your pronunciation is close enough, they'll keep talking to you naturally, giving you way more exposure to the language. And no, you don't need to sound perfect, but you need to sound effortless enough that people don't have to work real hard to understand you. There's one trick for working on your pronunciation. It's called back chaining. I use it a lot in class. You take a tricky word. Let's take a Russian word just for the sake of it, so it's not just English. Вздрогну, which means I will flinch. Instead of struggling through all those consonants at once, we're going to break it down, starting at the end. And we're going to start with nu, which is the very final syllable. Nu, nu. Then we're going to add dra and nu. Drono, drono, drono. Then we're going to go zdro, zdro, zdrog, zdrog, no, zdrogno. And finally, after we've done enough repeating, we're going to move on towards the final version. Working backwards, you train your tongue without getting overwhelmed, without thinking about the final product when it's too soon to think about it. So here's today's takeaway. Pronunciation isn't just about sounding good, it's about learning efficiently. If you train your ears first, every other part of language learning, whether it be reading, speaking, even memorizing vocabulary, gets easier. And finally, pronunciation is a skill, not a talent. Anyone can learn it with the right tools. So don't let broken words slow you down. Start training your ears and watch how everything else falls into place. If this episode of Beyond the Accent gave you an aha moment, share it with a friend. And as always, keep speaking, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.